A woman sits in a wheelchair at the front of a Massachusetts courtroom. She will never walk again. And she is not here to argue about whether she killed her 3 children. She has admitted that she did. What she's fighting over is whether she understood what she was doing at all. On one side, prosecutors call it calculated, meticulous, a mother in complete control. On the other side, her own attorney says she was drowning in an illness so severe, she believed a voice was commanding her, telling her, "This is your last chance." 2 completely different women, one basement, one afternoon in January. And 12 jurors now have to decide which one was really there. I'm Cole, and this is Midnight Files. Before we go any further, one thing has to be said clearly, because the law demands it. Lindsay Clancy has pleaded not guilty. In the eyes of the court, she is presumed innocent unless the Commonwealth proves otherwise. What you're about to hear is a case still being argued, right now, in front of a jury that has not reached a verdict. So let's go back to the beginning. Lindsay and Patrick Clancy met in 2013. They started dating, moved in together in 2015, and built the kind of life a lot of people quietly dream about. A house in Duxbury, Massachusetts, a quiet coastal town south of Boston, and 3 kids. Cora came first, then Dawson, then Callan. Cora was 5. Her nanny would later describe her on the stand as simply lovely. Dawson was 3, full of energy, she said, and funny. The morning of the last day of their lives, Dawson dressed himself for the first time ever, and his dad caught a photo of him mid-leap, arms in the air, grinning. Callan was the baby, 8 months old. Lindsay was a labor and delivery nurse. She spent her working life helping other mothers bring babies into the world. But according to testimony, after Callan was born, something in her started to slip. Patrick Clancy was the very first witness the prosecution called, and over 2 days on that stand, he walked the jury through his wife's decline, slowly and clearly fighting to hold himself together. He testified that after each of their children was born, Lindsay would get anxious when it came time to go back to work. But after Callan, she never went back at all. 3 kids, 3 different nap schedules, 3 sets of meets, a lot of stress, he told the jury. In September of 2022, at a wedding in New Hampshire, she told him during a walk that she was going to start taking Zoloft. "I think it's going to help with my anxiety and going back to work," he remembered her saying. She was also going to see a psychiatrist. He later learned she'd already gotten the prescription before she even told him. She took it for a while. Then she said it was wrecking her sleep, so she stopped. That fall she asked Patrick to sleep down in the basement, because she couldn't sleep next to him. She kept getting worse and worse, he testified. She switched psychiatrists, because whatever she was doing, it wasn't working. She came home with different medications. By Thanksgiving, Patrick said, she was in rough shape, not talking much, low energy, really depressed. And then came December, and in December, everything accelerated. In December of 2022, Lindsay switched to a new medication. That was really where her big spiral started, Patrick testified. She started losing a lot of weight, she got deeply depressed, and she started saying she was suicidal. That same month, she told Patrick something that no parent ever wants to hear from another parent. She said she was having intrusive thoughts about hurting their children. The way she was describing it was that something might happen to the kids, he told the jury. Patrick said he asked her directly, did she feel like she needed to be kept away from them? She said no. And this is the part that made it so confusing, so impossible to read. It was very confusing, he testified, because the next minute she was making them lunch or putting them to bed. And then this line, I never saw Lindsay harm the kids. That's the paradox at the center of this whole case. A woman telling her husband she was afraid of what her own mind might do, and in the very next breath, tucking her children into bed. Late December, it reached a breaking point. Lindsay told her own father she wanted to die. She was taken to Massachusetts General Hospital. One doctor recommended inpatient treatment. She started a day program in Providence instead, Patrick driving her there and picking her up every day. And by New Year's Eve, she was back in an emergency room. Same fear, Suicide. I was exhausted, Patrick told the jury. I said, I think it's time to go to McLean. We didn't have a diagnosis, so we just didn't know what was wrong. Sit with that for a second. After months of appointments, medications, hospitals, programs, nobody could tell this family exactly what was wrong with her. She was admitted to McLean Hospital, one of the most respected psychiatric hospitals in the country, and after a stay there, she started asking to be discharged, so she could make it to her daughter Cora's birthday party. On January 5, 2023, she was released. 19 days later, all 3 of her children would be dead. To understand what the two sides are fighting about, you have to understand 3 different things, because they get blurred together constantly, and they are not the same. Postpartum depression is common. Something like 1 in 8 new mothers experience it. The crushing sadness, the exhaustion, the sense of failing. Postpartum anxiety runs alongside it, the racing, intrusive fears. And then there's postpartum psychosis. That one is rare, roughly 1 to 2 in every 1,000 births. And it is a genuine psychiatric emergency. It can involve delusions, hallucinations, a person losing their grip on what is real and what isn't. Now, here's what matters. The defense says Lindsay had postpartum psychosis. That is their claim. What she actually had, at the exact moment of the killings, is one of the central questions this jury has to answer. It has not been settled. Hold on to that. Because now we come to the day itself. January 24, 2023. And according to her ex-husband's testimony, it was a good day. Cell phone records and court documents lay out her movements. She brought her daughter to the doctor. She took photos of the kids playing in the snow. She texted with Patrick, who was working downstairs, and she texted with her mother. Patrick was buried in a busy workday in the basement. He said he only went up once or twice, and when the prosecutor asked him, was Lindsay having suicidal thoughts that day? She was having one of her best days, he said. One of her best days. And then, that afternoon, she asked him to run out, to pick up takeout, and to pick up medication. He left. Here is the two sides split completely, and never come back together. Prosecutors say that errand was the plan. They allege she deliberately sent him to a restaurant far enough away to give herself time. Assistant District Attorney Shannon Buckingham told the jury that Dawson, Cora, and Callan were deliberately and meticulously killed. Prosecutor Jennifer Sprague put it even more bluntly. This was not a woman in the throes of psychosis on January 24, 2023. Their word for Lindsay Clancy was calculated, controlling, meticulous, and manipulative. A mother, they argue, who was in control the entire time. The defense sees the exact same day, and sees a mind that had broken. Attorney Kevin Reddington told the jury Lindsay had been prescribed as many as 13 different medications in the months before that day, a combination he argued had actually caused, in his words, homicidal ideation, suicidal ideation. He said she had no reason to do this. She had no motive, he told them. She loved her children. A heck of a mother, he called her. And he said she was living, right now, in her own private hell. Because she knows what happened to those kids. Same afternoon. 2 irreconcilable stories. While Patrick was gone, Lindsay took the children into the basement. Out of respect for Cora, Dawson, and Callan, I'm not going to dwell on the details of how they died. What both sides agree on, what the defense does not dispute, is that Lindsay Clancy strangled her 3 children with exercise resistance bands. Then she cut herself, and she jumped from a 2nd-story window. She survived, but the fall shattered her spine. She would be paralyzed from the waist down. And then Patrick came home. He pulled into the driveway. The house was quiet, too quiet. He found Lindsay outside, on the ground, in the snow, bleeding. He asked her what happened. She told him, I tried to kill myself. He asked where the kids were. She said, the basement. He called 911, and he stayed on the phone as first responders raced toward the house. And because he stayed on that line, the jury heard everything. They heard him beg her to open her eyes. They heard him say he had to go check on the children. And then they heard the moment he reached the bottom of the basement stairs. He found Cora first, then Callan, right beside her. He tore the bands off. He went looking for Dawson and found him in the home office. He went back and forth between his children, trying to give them CPR as a 911 dispatcher kept asking, "What's going on?" He couldn't find the words. He just screamed. A Duxbury police officer testified that he heard those screams from outside, ran in, and found Patrick in the basement. The officer testified that Patrick looked up at him and said, "She killed the kids." The judge sealed that 911 call from the public, but the jury heard it, and reporters in the room described jurors fighting back tears. Lindsay Clancy sat with her face in her hands and sobbed. Cora and Dawson died that evening. Baby Callan held on for 3 more days in the hospital before he died. 3 children, gone. Now, the investigation. And this is where the prosecution builds its case for a mind that was working, planning, aware. When first responders reached Lindsay, they treated her for a possible opioid overdose. She was given Narcan. State police recovered pill bottles from the kitchen. Later, Patrick himself, with his attorney present, turned over 9 more bottles of prescription medication to investigators. And here the prosecution made a pointed argument. A trooper testified about how many pills were in each bottle when it was filled, versus how many were left. The prosecutor's takeaway: there were a lot of pills prescribed, but not a lot of pills taken. Their theory: that Lindsay had stopped taking medications that might have helped her. But the defense had an answer for that too. Patrick testified that her prescriptions were constantly being adjusted and stopped, based on how badly she was reacting to them. Not defiance. Chaos. Investigators also searched the home. In a kitchen cabinet, a detective found books and notebooks about postpartum depression and anxiety. A postpartum anxiety workbook, blank, nothing filled in. A notebook listing her medications and when to take them. And a book with a title that lands like a punch to the gut. Good moms have scary thoughts. 2 ways to read that cabinet. A woman desperately trying to save herself. Or, as the prosecution would frame it, a woman who knew exactly what was happening in her own head. And that question, did she know, is the entire ballgame, because of one specific piece of Massachusetts law. Here it's not called the insanity defense. Lawyers call it lack of criminal responsibility. And the standard comes from a 1967 case, Commonwealth versus McCool. Under that standard, a person is not criminally responsible for a crime if, because of a mental disease or defect, they lack the substantial capacity to do one of 2 things. Either to appreciate that what they were doing was wrong, or to control their behavior and follow the law, even if they knew it was wrong. Here's the critical part, the part that surprises people. The burden is not on Lindsay to prove she was insane. In Massachusetts, the burden is on the prosecution to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that she was criminally responsible. So the prosecution isn't just proving she did it. She admits she did it. They have to prove she knew what she was doing and could have stopped. This is why the medical testimony matters so much and why it cuts both ways. A psychiatrist named Dr. Shah evaluated Lindsay 5 days after the killings. At first, she testified, Lindsay was confused, made mistakes on a cognitive test, and had visual hallucinations after her spinal surgery. Dr. Shah's diagnosis at that point was delirium, possibly from anesthesia, oxygen problems, and elevated heart rate. But she said that resolved by the next day. In later evaluations, Dr. Shah described a very different picture. Lindsay was calm and cooperative, organized, goal-directed. She denied hallucinations. She denied any intent to hurt herself or anyone else. For the prosecution, that's the point. That's not a woman lost in psychosis. But then Reddington stood up for cross-examination and landed what analysts called an extremely helpful concession. He asked Dr. Shah directly, people can communicate and plan, and act on plans, even if they're in the middle of a psychosis, right? And she agreed. She also agreed that Lindsay had been an honest patient. That single exchange is the hinge of the defense. Because if you can plan and still be psychotic, then every calculated step the prosecution points to stops being proof of anything. There's another layer here, too. Since the tragedy,
Both Lindsay and Patrick have filed separate civil lawsuits against her medical providers, alleging they failed to properly diagnose and monitor her, and instead loaded her up with a disorganized mix of psychiatric drugs that made everything worse.
One of those suits points to a psychiatric expert, Dr. Margaret Spinelli of Columbia, who evaluated Lindsay for hours more than a year after the deaths. Her assessment, cited in the filing, bipolar disorder with psychosis and postpartum onset, that had been missed. The theory being that antidepressants can trigger mania and instability in someone who's actually bipolar. The providers have not accepted that characterization, and McLean Hospital, citing patient privacy, declined to comment on her care.
But notice what that means. Years later, the experts still don't fully agree on what was wrong with Lindsay Clancy, and the jury has to decide what was happening inside her mind in the span of a single afternoon. There's one more thing you should know about how this trial is being run. Before testimony one day this week, Lindsay's team agreed to a stipulation.
A stipulation is a formal legal agreement that certain facts are true, so nobody has to spend days proving them in court. In this case, it covers the chain of custody for physical evidence, blood, DNA, and so on. Reddington told the court, plainly, "We have not been contesting the government's case in chief." And that tells you everything about the strategy. The defense isn't fighting the physical facts. They're conceding them, because for them, the facts of what happened were never the argument. The only argument is what was happening in her mind.
Patrick Clancy, her ex-husband, now remarried, a man who came home to the worst thing a father can imagine, has said in interviews that he forgives her, that he sees her as sick, not evil. In The New Yorker, he put it this way: "I wasn't married to a monster. I was married to someone who got sick." He asked her once if she had planned it, if that's why she sent him out of the house. According to him, she said no, that it wasn't a plan at all, that it just happened, like a snap of the fingers. Prosecutors don't believe that, and that is exactly what this jury has to weigh. So here's where it stands, as of today. The prosecution is still putting on its case. This week, jurors heard from the doctors and nurses who tried to save the children, from the surgeon who treated Lindsay's injuries, from the troopers who cataloged her pills, and, most recently, from the family's former nanny, who testified that Lindsay had confided in her about her postpartum struggles and her trouble sleeping. When prosecutors played a video that Nanny had once sent of baby Callan drinking a bottle, Lindsay covered her face and cried. The defense hasn't even fully begun. Their own experts, the ones expected to testify about postpartum psychosis, are still to come. The judge has said this trial could run 6 to 8 weeks. If the jury finds Lindsay Clancy guilty of first-degree murder, she faces life in prison with no chance of parole. If they find her not criminally responsible, she doesn't walk free. She'd be committed to a state psychiatric hospital, reviewed periodically to see whether she could ever safely live in the community again. 3 children, Cora, Dawson, and Callan, are gone. That will not change, whatever the verdict. What the physical events were is not really in dispute. What was happening inside Lindsay Clancy's mind that afternoon is the only thing that is. Was she a mother in control of a calculated, unthinkable act? Or was she a woman so lost inside her own illness that she could no longer tell right from wrong? 12 people are going to have to decide. And here's the question I'll leave with you tonight. If we can't be certain what was real inside someone's mind in the moment they did the unthinkable, how are we supposed to be certain enough to judge it?